Rivers Blaine had not planned to start a fight with anyone when she bought the property on the edge of Brookvale County. She wanted quiet, a sense of continuity, and a space that carried the strange, layered beauty of old land. The estate had once belonged to a botanical institute in the early 70s, and tucked behind the main structure stood a small cedar cabin that seemed almost shy among the trees. It was built decades ago for visiting researchers, and its weathered beams, uneven porch, and narrow windows gave it the gentle melancholy of something that had survived time by being forgotten. To her, that cabin was the heart of the place, not the main house. It was where she felt a pulse, an unspoken link to whoever had stood there before her, listening to the same wind threading through the pines. She had come here not to escape the city, but to study how spaces like this absorbed human presence and memory. Her university grant called it a field project on sustainable restoration. She thought of it as reanimation, bringing dignity back to something that had been left to decay without noise or complaint. She restored the roof herself, hired local carpenters to stabilize the frame, and carefully cataloged every original piece of wood she could preserve. By spring, the cabin looked exactly as it might have in 1974, simple, modest, alive. Neighbors occasionally passed by to watch her work, offering polite smiles and curious glances, but never conversation. There was a distance in this community, a code of invisible lines, and she respected that. Most of the land around her belonged to a homeowners association, though her deed indicated her parcel had been detached from their authority long before she purchased it. The real estate agent had even pointed out that as a non-member, she wouldn't have to deal with community meetings, aesthetic bylaws, or the endless email chains about mailbox colors. It sounded perfect. She could study, rebuild, and breathe without interference. For a few months, that peace held. The days followed a rhythm of quiet industry, mornings filled with sawdust and the low hum of power tools, afternoons with notebooks spread across the porch table and cups of coffee gone cold while she traced the property's history through old land records. It was ordinary, grounded work, the kind that made her feel tethered to something authentic. Then, one humid morning in June, as the mist still clung to the treetops, she found a large envelope wedged into the gate. The paper was thick, the header embossed with the logo of the Brookvale Homeowners Association. She frowned, assuming it was a misdelivery, until she saw her name printed beneath the address, neat and deliberate. Inside, the letter was short, written in the clipped, emotionless tone of bureaucratic confidence. It stated that an unauthorized structure had been identified on her property, a non-compliant dwelling that violated community development codes. Immediate removal was required within 30 days to avoid penalties. Her pulse steadied for a moment before rising, disbelief sliding into irritation. She reread the letter, then again, tracing each word as if meaning might shift under scrutiny. The guest cabin, the one built decades before the association even existed, was being labeled illegal. The letter cited ordinances that hadn't existed when the cabin was constructed, as though time itself could be rewritten to fit the HOA's convenience. She looked up from the page toward the trees. The quiet suddenly sharpened into something brittle. There was no address or phone number for direct contact, only a post office box and a name at the bottom. C. Franzen, President. Her first instinct was that it was a clerical mistake, a form mailed in error. Yet beneath the irritation, a faint unease began to stir, not because of what was written, but because of the precision with which it was addressed. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure the letter found her. Rivers placed the letter on the kitchen counter and tried to convince herself that the whole thing was an administrative mix-up. Bureaucracies loved their forms and their blanket notifications, and it was entirely possible that someone at the HOA had simply pulled an outdated map, failing to notice that her parcel was no longer under their jurisdiction. Yet, as the afternoon light shifted across the room, she caught herself reading the letter again and again, each time finding new layers of deliberate wording, phrases like unauthorized occupation and immediate rectification of violation, that carried the sterile cruelty of people who enjoyed control for its own sake. That night, she could not sleep. The envelope sat on the table like an accusation, a single piece of paper that had somehow stripped her of the sense of safety she had built around the cabin. By morning, she decided to call the HOA office, though there was no phone number listed on the letterhead. After searching online, she found a generic contact number buried in a directory. The woman who answered sounded polite in the mechanical way of someone trained to be both courteous and useless. When Rivers explained the situation, the woman interrupted her with practiced calm, saying, "If you've received official notice, Ms. Blaine, that means the matter has already been reviewed by the Compliance Committee." Rivers asked how such a review could take place without her participation, and the woman replied, "All property evaluations are based on community visual records. You would have received prior correspondence." Rivers informed her that she had received nothing, but the voice on the other end only repeated, "All notifications are issued by certified mail. If you did not receive them, that is an issue with your postal carrier." The circular logic left Rivers dizzy. She asked who C. Franzen was and was told, after a pause, that he was the current president of the board, and that appointments with him were not standard practice. When she pressed for an address, the line went silent for several seconds, before the woman added quietly, "The office is on Ridgeview Drive, behind the glass-front plaza. We don't usually handle matters in person." The call ended abruptly, the click of the receiver final and faintly contemptuous. Later that day, Rivers drove into town, partly out of anger, partly out of curiosity. The HOA office was smaller than she expected, a renovated single-story building squeezed between a dental clinic and a dry cleaner. Its glass facade gleamed too brightly under the afternoon sun, the kind of artificial cleanliness that tried to disguise decay. Inside, the air smelled of copier toner and disinfectant. A man in a pale blue shirt sat behind the reception desk, typing. When Rivers introduced herself and mentioned the letter, he barely looked up before sliding a clipboard toward her, asking her to sign in for compliance review. His tone suggested she had already lost whatever argument she thought she was about to make. She refused the clipboard and asked to speak directly with C. Franzen. The man's eyes flickered with a trace of annoyance before he disappeared through a frosted glass door. Minutes passed. The office was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that existed only in places where people were afraid to speak above a whisper. Finally, the door opened, and a tall man in an impeccably pressed suit appeared. His smile was precise, unhurried. "Ms. Blaine," he said, extending a hand that felt colder than it should have. "I understand there's been some confusion." She explained that the cabin predated the association, that her deed excluded her from HOA jurisdiction, and that she had all the necessary permits for restoration. Franzen listened with the patience of someone waiting for a commercial break to end. When she finished, he said, "The problem, Ms. Blaine, is that jurisdictional boundaries evolve. The association's charter was amended last year to include transitional parcels such as yours, ensuring uniform standards across the district. Your guest structure, unfortunately, does not meet those standards." Rivers stared at him. "You can't amend property lines retroactively," she said. He smiled again, the expression never touching his eyes. "We can when it's a matter of public safety. The building obstructs an emergency access corridor." She laughed, not out of humor but disbelief. "There's no corridor. There's a line of maples and a slope of land that's existed since before you were born." His voice cooled. "If you wish to contest the notice, you may do so in writing. However, continuing to occupy or modify the structure constitutes a violation of Municipal Code 47B. I suggest compliance. It's far less complicated." When she left, the air outside felt heavier, thick with the kind of humidity that carries tension in every molecule. The parking lot shimmered with heat, yet she shivered. On her windshield, beneath the wiper, someone had tucked a folded pamphlet bearing the HOA's logo. Inside was a photograph of a manicured neighborhood, all identical facades and trimmed hedges, above a slogan that read, "Order preserves value." The words lingered like a taunt. That evening, she spread every document she owned across the dining table: the deed, the grant approval, the surveyor's map, the restoration permits, even the correspondence from the county's environmental board that had applauded her for preserving native materials. Everything was legitimate. But as she studied the boundary map, she noticed a faint dotted line running across the lower edge of her lot, one that hadn't appeared on the original file she had signed at closing. The notation beside it read, "Proposed Community Link Access." She had never heard of such a plan. Searching county records online brought nothing. It existed only on this version of the map, and the digital signature in the corner belonged to someone she didn't recognize. She printed it out, marking the dotted line with a red pen. A thought began to take shape, faint but stubborn. Maybe this wasn't about a code violation at all. Maybe they wanted something else, something under the cabin or on the land itself. The letter's precision, the speed of the follow-up, the way Franzen had said transitional parcels, as if reading from a confidential manual. It all pointed to intention, not mistake. She walked out onto the porch, the woods whispering around her, and for the first time since moving there, she felt watched. It was not a dramatic feeling, not the kind that makes one look over a shoulder. It was subtler, like the sensation of a hand resting lightly on the back of her neck. Somewhere out there, behind the symmetry of bylaws and polite signatures, someone was waiting for her to give up the fight before it began. Rivers decided that silence was the most dangerous kind of cooperation. The longer she waited, the easier it would be for the HOA to pretend that her lack of response was compliance. 2 days after her meeting with Franzen, she returned to the office determined to deliver her written objection in person. She printed copies of every relevant document, bound them in a folder, and wrote a letter outlining the historical status of the guest cabin and the illegitimacy of the association's claim over her property. When she arrived, the same receptionist from before avoided eye contact as she placed the envelope on the counter. Rivers asked that it be date-stamped and filed officially. The man hesitated, then took the envelope, sliding it into a drawer instead of the outgoing tray. "You'll receive a response by mail," he said. "We don't process disputes in person." His tone carried something faintly mocking, the faint condescension of someone who believed he was untouchable. She left before anger could make her words careless. That evening, while reviewing her notes, she heard a vehicle slowing near her gate. The sound lingered longer than it should have, tires crunching over gravel in a hesitant rhythm. She stepped to the window and saw a white SUV idling at the edge of her driveway. 2 men in orange safety vests stood beside it, pointing toward the slope that led down to the cabin. When she stepped outside, they froze for a moment before one of them lifted a clipboard as if it were a shield. "Routine inspection," he called. "Association request." She told them they had no authority on her land and asked them to leave immediately. They exchanged glances before backing away, murmuring something about just verifying line access. The SUV disappeared down the road, but the feeling it left behind stayed with her long after the sound of the engine faded. By morning, small fluorescent stakes had appeared along the western edge of her property, thin plastic rods with bright orange ribbons that flickered in the breeze. Each bore the same printed code, R47B. She recognized the number from Franzen's citation letter. The message was clear. They were marking her land as if it already belonged to them. She photographed the stakes, logged the coordinates, and sent an email to the county zoning office requesting verification. The reply came a day later, brief and unhelpful. "No current zoning changes on file," it read. "Boundary adjustments under HOA review are considered private matters." It was bureaucratic language for "we won't get involved." At night she began noticing the faint hum of drones. At first she thought it was the wind through the trees until a flash of light passed her window, a small red diode gliding silently across the dark sky. The next morning she found tire tracks cutting through the field behind the cabin. Whoever was coming here knew the blind spots of her cameras and moved with a confidence that suggested prior access. She contacted the sheriff's department, But the deputy who returned her call sounded weary, explaining that community enforcement conflicts were civil, not criminal, and that unless there was property damage or trespassing caught on film, there was little they could do. When she mentioned the drones, he sighed. "They're cheap now," he said. "Half the county's got them. Could be kids." A week passed. Letters arrived almost daily now, each one slightly more severe than the last. The language escalated from notice of violation to preliminary enforcement intent. One morning she found an envelope stamped with red ink reading "Final Warning." Inside, the letter claimed she had failed to respond to previous communications and would be subject to financial penalties. The signature at the bottom was the same, C. Franzen, though the handwriting of the initials looked oddly different, sharper, as if traced by someone imitating his style. It was the kind of forgery that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know how carefully bureaucrats repeated themselves. She kept the letter in a separate folder marked "Inconsistencies." Her patience fractured the day she discovered the first survey flag nailed directly into the cedar frame of the cabin. It had been driven deep, splitting the wood, as if to make a point. Rivers pulled it out and held it like a weapon, feeling the tremor of adrenaline she hadn't known she still possessed. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a campaign of pressure. She wrote to the county recorder's office, attaching photos and referencing her deed. The reply came 2 days later from a clerk who sounded apologetic but powerless. "Your parcel records show a pending administrative review initiated by the Brookvale HOA. Until that review is concluded, property disputes cannot be adjudicated by the county." A pending review, something she had never been notified of, meant they had filed a claim behind her back. On the third Friday of July, an HOA meeting notice appeared in her mailbox. It wasn't addressed to her specifically, but to affected parties within Section 12B. The meeting was scheduled for that evening in the association's community hall. Rivers decided to go. When she arrived, the parking lot was packed. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a small stage where Franzen stood with a microphone, smiling the polished smile of a man who believed his control was absolute. He spoke about ongoing development alignment and necessary compliance adjustments for safety. Every phrase was a euphemism for expansion. Then, without naming her directly, he referred to a non-conforming structure posing potential hazard to community infrastructure. People nodded, murmuring agreement. She raised her hand. Franzen hesitated before gesturing toward her with a kind of theatrical civility. "Ms. Blaine? Yes. You wanted to comment?" Her voice was calm, too calm. She explained the age of the structure, its historical registration, the boundaries defined in her deed, the illegality of their retroactive jurisdiction. The room shifted uncomfortably. A man in the front row muttered, "We all follow the rules. Why should she be different?" Franzen's smile widened, thin as paper. "This isn't about singling anyone out," he said. "It's about consistency." Then, turning slightly toward her, he added in a lower tone, "We can't make exceptions, even for passionate historians." Laughter rippled through the audience, polite and poisonous. She stood for a moment longer, feeling every pair of eyes on her, then left without another word. Outside, the air smelled of cut grass and ozone. On the windshield of her car lay another pamphlet, this one showing a rendering of the area labeled Proposed Phase 2 Integration Plan. Her land was shaded in pale gray, overlaid with the words Future Green Access Path. They were already planning to absorb it. As she drove home through the dark, a new emotion took root beneath her fear. Something sharper, steadier. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one, but not on their terms. Somewhere behind the facade of bylaws and neighborhood unity, there was a paper trail that connected this small patch of land to something larger, and she intended to find it before they buried her cabin beneath their definition of order. The next morning, Rivers woke to the sound of distant machinery. At first, she thought it might be one of the nearby construction crews working on a new road that the county had been discussing for months, But the noise was too close, a low mechanical rumble that made the glass in her windows tremble. When she stepped outside, the fog still clung to the ground, thick enough to blur the line between her property and the forest beyond, and yet through the haze she could see a yellow excavator parked just beyond her western boundary. Two men in reflective vests stood near it, pointing toward the slope that led down to the cabin, their voices carrying fragments of bureaucratic jargon. Soil analysis, drainage line, access permit. She approached them, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and called out, asking what they were doing on her land. The older man turned, his face unreadable beneath his cap, and said they were conducting a subsurface evaluation for the association's future infrastructure project. When she demanded to see the permit, he shrugged and said the paperwork was under municipal coordination. It was the perfect phrase, long, vague, and meaningless, and she told them to leave immediately, that the land was privately owned and under no HOA jurisdiction, but the men only exchanged looks before one of them muttered that she should take it up with headquarters. By the time she ran back to grab her phone, they were already packing up their equipment, the excavator reversing with a mechanical groan before vanishing down the dirt path that cut across the boundary line. Something about the encounter left her uneasy. The confidence of the workers, the way they avoided confrontation, and the mention of a subsurface evaluation, all of it felt orchestrated. She decided to verify what they had been doing. She marked the area they had disturbed and returned later with a shovel. The soil was freshly turned, darker than the rest, and beneath the first few inches, she found a thin, flexible conduit. Plastic, pale gray, the kind used for fiber or low-voltage lines. It ran parallel to the slope, disappearing beneath the cabin. There had been no installation work authorized on her land. Whoever had placed it there had done so quietly, perhaps at night, and had connected it to something unseen. For the first time, the possibility of surveillance crossed her mind in a literal sense. The HOA's language about visual records and remote compliance verification suddenly seemed less abstract. She followed the conduit until it vanished beneath a large root, marking the spot with a flag. That evening she drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk recognized her name immediately, his expression tightening as he handed her a small stack of maps. "I was told you might come by," he said carefully. "You should know. The association filed a property modification request 2 weeks ago. It's under review, but it temporarily suspends all owner-initiated zoning appeals for that parcel." Rivers stared at him. "They filed it without notifying me." He nodded, his eyes darting toward a security camera on the ceiling. "You're not the first," he said quietly, "but you didn't hear that from me." Back at home, she compared the maps with the ones from her deed. The new version included a shaded corridor cutting straight through her land, labeled Emergency Easement Reserve. It aligned exactly with the path of the conduit she had uncovered. Her mind raced through possibilities. If the HOA could prove that corridor was part of their easement, they could justify entry, excavation, even demolition. The discovery made her physically ill. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table, staring at the maps until the lines blurred together. It was then that she noticed something strange. In the lower right corner of the map, next to the county stamp, was a small signature. A. Reiner, Surveyor. The name was familiar. She rummaged through her earlier paperwork and found it again, on an old document related to the original Botanical Institute that had once owned the land. Arthur Reiner had been one of the researchers who helped design the irrigation layout for the property in the 1970s. He wasn't a surveyor. He had been a soil scientist. Somehow, decades after his death, his name was being used on official county filings. The next day, Rivers drove to the archives at the university library, where the Institute's papers were stored. The archivist, a gray-haired woman named Leona, led her into a back room lined with metal drawers. She found the Reiner file easily, a collection of maps, photographs, and notes on hydrology. One folder contained a letter from the county planning board dated 1982, granting the Institute perpetual access to an underground aquifer located beneath several adjoining parcels, including the land where the HOA's office now stood. According to the file, the aquifer was classified as public infrastructure, meaning it could never be sold or built over without state approval. Rivers felt a chill travel through her chest as the implications set in. The HOA's headquarters wasn't just built on questionable property. It was constructed directly above a protected aquifer that should have remained public. If the wrong people found out, the entire association's legal foundation could collapse. Driving back through the rain, she tried to process the enormity of what she had discovered. The harassment, the fabricated violations, the sudden urgency of their actions. It wasn't about her cabin at all. It was about the land beneath it. The association needed control of her parcel to finalize the expansion, to secure their hold over an area they had no right to claim. She arrived home to find another envelope taped to her door, this one larger, almost ceremonial in presentation. Inside was a notice of temporary restriction pending review. In effect, it forbade her from performing any construction or maintenance on her property until the HOA's environmental compliance audit was complete. It was absurd. They were now weaponizing her own restoration project against her. She sat on the porch as thunder rolled across the hills, the letter trembling in her hand, and for the first time, she felt something close to fear, not for the loss of her home, but for the precision of whoever was orchestrating this campaign. Over the next week, she received no mail, no calls, nothing. The quiet felt deliberate, a silence that pressed in from all directions. One evening, she noticed the reflection of light in the windows of the cabin, a faint, rhythmic flicker like the pulse of a sensor. When she went inside, she found a small black device wedged beneath the lower beam near the doorframe, blinking faintly red. It was a motion transmitter, powered by a lithium cell. Someone had placed it there recently. She photographed it, removed the battery, and stored the device in a sealed jar. Then she sat at her desk and began drafting a formal complaint addressed directly to the county attorney, detailing every incident, every letter, and every irregularity. She included copies of the maps, the Reiner signature, and the aquifer documentation. When she finally sent the packet the next morning, she expected silence or delay. Instead, she received a call from a woman identifying herself as Deputy County Counsel. Her tone was measured, cautious, but not dismissive. "Ms. Blaine," she said, "I've reviewed your materials. You should know that if what you're suggesting is accurate, the implications extend beyond zoning. That aquifer is under state protection. Any structure built on it without authorization could be subject to seizure." Rivers felt a surge of relief cut with disbelief. The woman continued, "We'll open an inquiry, but I advise you to be careful. If the association learns that the county is investigating, they may attempt to remove or alter records." By the time she ended the call, the sky had cleared. She stood outside, breathing in the scent of wet earth, the cabin gleaming softly in the late sun. For the first time since the conflict began, she felt a current of hope, fragile but real. She had proof, leverage, and the possibility of official scrutiny. Yet even as that thought took hold, she couldn't shake the image of the blinking sensor or the quiet certainty that someone had placed it there to measure her patience, not her movement. In that moment, she realized the battle had already shifted. It was no longer about the cabin itself, but about the invisible systems of control layered beneath every inch of the ground she stood on. Systems that were designed to make people surrender before they ever thought to fight. The county's inquiry did not remain a secret for long. Within a week of submitting her documents, Rivers began receiving subtle reminders that someone was watching her again. The first came as a voicemail with no voice, just the faint hum of static followed by a single click. The next morning she discovered a tire valve removed from her car, the rubber cap placed neatly on the hood like a signature. It wasn't vandalism, it was a message. "We know where you are, and we don't need to touch the house to touch you." The sense of intrusion worked its way into every small moment of her day. When she went to the grocery store, she noticed the same silver sedan parked 2 rows behind her, engine idling, its driver pretending to check his phone. When she returned home that evening, she found a notice pinned to her gate announcing an emergency community survey to be conducted over the weekend. The letterhead bore the HOA's logo, but no signature. She tried calling the county attorney's office, only to be told the assigned counsel had been temporarily reassigned, and her file was under administrative transfer. Bureaucracy had already begun to fold in on itself. On Saturday morning, the surveyors arrived without warning. There were 4 of them this time, in unmarked trucks, hauling measuring rods and tripods. When she stepped out to confront them, they ignored her entirely, walking across her property as if it were already theirs. One man, older and heavier than the rest, muttered into his radio, his words blending with the whir of the device mounted on his tripod. "Mark from the creek bed to the line of sight," he said. "Include the cabin perimeter." She demanded to see their authorization, and the youngest of them handed her a laminated card that read, "Brookvale Compliance Division." The card bore no county seal. "That's not an official credential," she said, but he simply shrugged and continued his work. She called the sheriff's office again. This time, no one answered. By the time she finished leaving a message, the men were gone, leaving behind a field of bright red flags cutting diagonally across the property like an open wound. That night, she sat at her desk staring at the photographs of the aquifer maps. The logic of what they were doing had become clear. The HOA was pushing a false environmental narrative to justify land reclassification. If they could prove that the terrain required infrastructure protection, they could override private ownership under the pretext of safety. They were manufacturing compliance data, manipulating reports to suggest erosion and water contamination where none existed. It was a form of quiet theft executed through paperwork and field optics. She decided to counter them with the only weapon she had left: exposure through evidence. The next morning she drove to the local newspaper office, a modest brick building that looked more like a tax service than a newsroom. She met with an editor named Lena, who listened carefully as Rivers explained the situation. Lena leafed through the documents, her expression sharpening when she reached the aquifer report. "If this is true," she said, "they've been sitting on a federal violation for years." Rivers warned her that the HOA had influence, that they would retaliate, but Lena only smiled faintly. "That's what makes it worth printing," she said. They agreed to hold off publication until verification from the State Environmental Board could be obtained. Rivers left the office feeling a strange blend of relief and dread. She knew that once this information became public, there would be no going back. 2 days later, the retaliation began. A certified letter arrived, declaring that the HOA had initiated emergency proceedings against her for obstruction of public works. The language was absurd. There were no public works, but the implication was serious. Attached was a notice of temporary injunction filed in municipal court, effectively freezing her ability to modify or even enter portions of her own property. Her cabin was marked as a secured zone. When she called the clerk's office, they confirmed that the filing was real, stamped and approved by a magistrate who, coincidentally, had served on the HOA's board 5 years earlier. She realized the system was collapsing inward, all its walls connected, every door leading back to the same locked room. That evening, she received an email from Lena. The Environmental Board had responded. The aquifer did exist and was classified as protected infrastructure, but the records had been flagged for internal review. No one at the state level could comment until the review was complete. It was the perfect stalling maneuver. Rivers printed the email, knowing it was evidence of interference, but the victory felt hollow. The following morning she woke to find her driveway blocked by a temporary fence made of aluminum panels. A sign zip-tied to the center read, "Hazardous ground. Access restricted pending assessment." Beyond it, she could see fresh tire marks near the cabin, proof that someone had been there overnight. She climbed the fence and found the door of the cabin ajar. The lock snapped cleanly at the hinge. Inside, nothing was taken, but the sense of violation was palpable. On the desk lay a single piece of paper with 6 words written in thick marker. "You can't build over what's ours." The words looped in her head all day like a curse. She drove to the courthouse the next morning to file a report. The deputy clerk accepted her paperwork without comment, but refused to provide a copy of the injunction record. "Confidential proceeding," he said, eyes fixed on the screen. She realized that on paper she was being erased in real time, her ownership frozen, her rights suspended, her evidence buried under legal fog. On the drive home, she caught sight of a construction notice nailed to a power pole near the highway. It announced the upcoming development of Brookvale Green Corridor, Phase 2 integration, scheduled to begin the following quarter. Her parcel was listed as part of the corridor's initial segment. They hadn't even waited for the court ruling. That night the wind picked up, shaking the trees against the windows. She sat awake long after midnight, staring at the outline of the cabin below, the moonlight washing its roof in pale silver. She knew that by morning there could be another letter, another order, another reason for them to dig into what they claimed was their land. But something had changed inside her. The fear that had followed her for weeks hardened into resolve. They had chosen to make her property the battlefield for their lie, but they had also left a trail, maps, signatures, false permits, and the phantom of a dead scientist whose name they kept using. Somewhere in that paper labyrinth was the key that would undo everything, and if the law was too slow to find it, she would. Rivers arrived at the courthouse on the morning of the hearing, with the numb calm of someone who had already accepted the possibility of defeat. The air smelled faintly of rain and photocopier toner, a scent that clung to the marble corridors like residue from too many paper wars fought in silence. She had barely slept, spending the night reviewing every document, every discrepancy, every signature that didn't match. The folder in her hands felt heavier than it should have, not from weight, but from consequence. When she entered the courtroom, she saw Franzen sitting at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 2 lawyers in identical charcoal suits. His expression was mild, almost indulgent, as though the outcome were already written. On her side of the aisle sat only the county counsel, a woman named Ortiz, who had been reassigned to her case at the last minute. Ortiz nodded briefly, her face unreadable, but when she leaned toward Rivers, her voice was steady. "We have what we need," she whispered. "Just keep calm and let the evidence speak." The hearing began with routine formality. Franzen's attorney read a statement describing Rivers as a non-compliant landholder obstructing emergency access development, his voice smooth and detached. The words washed over her, sounding less like accusation than bureaucratic ritual. Ortiz rose, her tone measured, and presented the historical deed, the preservation permits, and finally the county maps showing the protected aquifer beneath the HOA's office site. The judge, a man with silver hair and the dry patience of someone who had seen every variety of civic deceit, leaned forward. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that the Plaintiff Association is operating from a building constructed illegally on government property." Ortiz nodded, sliding the aquifer documentation across the bench. "Not suggesting, Your Honor. Demonstrating. The structure stands directly over public infrastructure territory, designated as non-transferable. We also have evidence that the HOA has used falsified survey signatures to manipulate boundary lines in their favor." The room fell silent, except for the faint shuffle of papers. Franzen's face tightened for the first time, his composure cracking at the edges. His attorney requested a recess, claiming the new evidence had not been disclosed, but Ortiz countered that it was public record, just buried under layers of intentional misfiling. The judge agreed to proceed. As Ortiz read through the timeline of forged amendments, Rivers felt her pulse begin to sink with each word, each revelation peeling back another layer of the quiet conspiracy that had consumed her life. When Ortiz reached the part about the signature of Arthur Reiner, the long-dead scientist, the courtroom stirred. "According to the state archives," Ortiz said, Mr. Reiner passed away in 1993. Yet his signature appears on documents certified in 2021 under the association's expansion filings. She held up a copy of the map, her finger tracing the ink that was too smooth, too modern to belong to an old fountain pen. This isn't just negligence, Your Honor. It's fabrication. Franzen's voice cut through the air then, sharp and defensive. These claims are absurd. Our filings were vetted by municipal offices. We relied on their expertise. Ortiz didn't look at him when she replied. And yet those municipal offices were staffed by former HOA board members. That's not expertise, Mr. Franzen. That's collusion. The judge raised a hand for silence, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet anger. I will be issuing an immediate injunction against any further development actions by the Brookvale Homeowners Association, he said, pending full investigation by the State Property Commission. He turned his gaze toward Rivers. As for your structure, Ms. Blaine, it stands on lawful ground. The court recognizes it as historically exempt from current zoning ordinances. The decision landed like a physical blow, not from surprise, but from release. The air in the courtroom seemed to change temperature. Franzen's attorneys whispered urgently to each other, their earlier confidence dissolving. Rivers caught sight of Franzen's face, pale now, the corners of his mouth twitching with restrained fury. She knew this wasn't over. Men like him never accepted exposure as final. Still, when the gavel struck wood, the sound carried through her like an exhale she had been holding for months. Outside, the sky had cleared. Reporters were already gathering on the courthouse steps, drawn by rumor of the ruling. Ortiz declined to speak, her only comment being that the facts were self-evident once someone finally looked. Rivers walked past the crowd without stopping, the noise fading behind her as she descended the steps. For the first time, she could imagine breathing without the metallic taste of dread. Yet even in that fragile calm, she understood that the victory was only partial. The judge had ordered an investigation, but investigations could vanish, records could shift again, and people like Franzen had long memories. Still, a line had been drawn, on paper, in law, and in the soil beneath her feet, and she intended to defend it. That evening she returned home to find the cabin illuminated by the last light of dusk, standing quiet and whole amid the trees. The red flags were gone, pulled from the ground by unseen hands, leaving only shallow scars in the dirt. She stood at the edge of the porch, listening to the wind move through the pines, and realized the silence no longer felt oppressive. It was the sound of something ending. The battle had been fought not with violence, but with persistence, and though the war beneath the surface might continue, for now, the ground was hers again. The weeks that followed passed in a haze of stillness that felt almost unreal. For the first time in months, there were no letters, no officials at her gate, no unfamiliar cars idling by the road. The county's investigation expanded quietly, drawing in state auditors and environmental inspectors who confirmed what she and Ortiz had proven. The HOA's headquarters had been built entirely on restricted land, its foundations sunk directly into the public aquifer. When the report was released, the consequences rippled through the community like an aftershock. The association's charter was suspended pending reformation, several of its board members resigned, and Franzen himself vanished from public view after a terse statement about administrative misunderstandings. The building on Ridgeview Drive was sealed with yellow tape, its glass facade reflecting the irony of its own collapse. Rivers did not celebrate. She simply exhaled, the kind of long, quiet breath that belongs more to survival than to triumph. She spent her days repairing the damage around her property, filling the holes left by the surveyor's stakes, reseeding the torn soil, and repainting the cabin's porch rails. Each stroke of the brush felt like reclaiming something intangible, a rhythm of ordinary life that had once been stolen from her. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped by with awkward smiles and cautious words of solidarity. Some brought plants or jars of honey from their gardens, small gestures of apology that needed no explanation. One afternoon, as she was clearing brush near the boundary line, she uncovered the fragment of an old metal sign half buried in the dirt. The faded letters read, "Brookvale Botanical Research Reserve." She stood there for a long time, running her hand over the rusted surface, realizing the land itself had been trying to remind her what it once was, before all the paper wars and property lines. She decided to mount the sign on the cabin wall, not as a relic of defiance, but as a marker of continuity, proof that places could survive their misuses. When autumn came, the county approached her with an offer to collaborate on a heritage restoration program that would formally protect her parcel as an educational conservation site. She accepted, on the condition that the project remain open to the public, free from any private administrative control. On the day she signed the new agreement, she walked the length of her property from the gate to the stream, feeling the ground steady beneath her feet. The cabin stood quiet, golden in the late light, a witness to all that had tried to erase it. The air smelled of cedar and cold earth, and for the first time, she felt that the silence around her was no longer watching. It was listening.